truth. I was born in 1924 in Berlin, Germany, only 4 years after my brother Harry. I don't think he really liked the idea of a younger sister. In fact, I think he was always a bit jealous of me and the attention I got being the newborn child. My dad was a doctor at the time, and my mom didn't have a job, but she helped out my dad at the office sometimes. My dad was always at work, so my mom was the one to always take care of Harry and I, making us food or taking us to school. I still remember how I had always enjoyed going to elementary school. I found it a bit fun, even. I loved getting to see my friends all the time and getting to play with them. Life was alright back then. I can still so clearly remember the day everything changed. My whole life went up in flames that day. It was October of 1935 when the Nuremberg laws were announced. These laws prohibited the marriages of Jews and Germans, as well as the employment of German females under 45 years old in Jewish homes. It also stripped Jews of their German citizenship. Jews were no longer allowed the privileges of being a German citizen. That day was worse than the day the Germans burnt all the books that were considered un-German and replaced them with books like The Poisonous Mushroom. Since then, anti-Semitism had been growing bigger and bigger in Berlin. Of course it existed before, but it was never to this extent. I used to be able to do things that anyone else could, but on that one day in particular, everything just felt different, and things were drastically changing. After that day, I couldn't go anywhere without seeing Nazi flags all over walls and in store windows. I didn't know what was happening. Everything was changing. Jews were being arrested for no reason other than the fact they were Jews. I'd been sitting in class one day, as if it were a normal day, when suddenly Nazis rushed in and arrested my teacher right in front of us all. Seconds later, a new teacher walked in. He had brown hair and brown eyes. He didn't look like a German to me, because he wasn't blonde and didn't have blue eyes. But to my surprise, the first thing to come out of his mouth that day was, "You filthy Jews aren't worthy of going to this school." I was trembling. I went home straight from school that day, absolutely terrified. From that day on, I rarely left my house. Everywhere I went, I saw signs saying, "For Aryans only." Jews were now, more than ever, not accepted into society, and weren't allowed to do things that other non-Jews could. I wasn't allowed to play with my friends from school, because I was a Jew, and they were Germans. Things progressively got worse and worse for my family, and the rest of the Jews in Germany. I can so visibly recall what happened on the night of November 9th, 1938. I'd been sitting in my room by my window when I heard loud cars driving in the streets, one after another. I didn't think much of it other than the Nazis were driving around. Suddenly, I heard clashes and started to smell smoke. I was in utter shock when I caught sight of what was happening right outside. Jewish stores were destroyed and burned. Broken glass was shattered all over the streets, and I can still so distinctly recall the laughs of the Nazis as they walked past these burning buildings. I just stood there, watching, in silence, as Nazis and members of the SS charged through the streets beating and murdering Jews. Hundreds arrested, not because they were doing anything wrong, but because they were Jews. Luckily for my family and me, that night didn't affect us. The Nazis didn't come to our home. Of course we saw it all, saw the horrors of what was happening, but none of us were attacked. I didn't realize at the time just how lucky we were. After that night, we thought the worst was over. I mean, what else could happen, I thought. I was sad to say I was wrong. So wrong. I was always so afraid to leave our home after that night. It just wasn't safe for us Jews anymore. One day, not too long after the night of broken glass, I was sitting at the dinner table when our door slammed open. It was the Nazis. 3 tall, strong-looking soldiers in matching uniforms barged into our home and started taking our valuables. I was in absolute fear and couldn't even think of what to do or say. I remember being so terrified in that very moment, knowing I could be killed at their will at any point. It was on that day that we found out that all Jews were being forced into ghettos. My family and I packed up all our belongings, all that we were allowed to take, and left our house. I didn't know that would be the last time I ever saw that house again. We were forced to wear these white armbands with a Jewish star on it so that the authorities could identify us Jews from a distance. When my family and I arrived at the ghetto, we were assigned a room on the second floor of an apartment. I had never seen such an awful sight. 12 people, including my family, crammed into a small, dirty room, dust everywhere, and people lying on the floor wherever they could fit. Years earlier, I would never have imagined this to be my life. I remember looking out the window to see barbed wire fences around parts of the ghetto and brick walls around other parts, creating a separation of us Jews from the rest of Germany. Food was so scarce, we barely ate. We were given very limited amounts of food, just enough for survival. My parents continued to look for work, hoping to make some money. My brother and I were put into forced labor. I had to work at some factory for hours and hours each day. When I got home on those days, I would mainly stay in the apartment, but on occasion, I would leave to go find food or just take a walk, and I would see small children trying to smuggle food in from outside the ghettos. They must have been very brave kids to do that. Times were bad back then, and only got worse. It wasn't long after we entered the ghettos that we were forced out. We must have been there no longer than a year, I'd say. I was finally getting used to the awful living conditions, or as much as I ever would be, but suddenly things changed again. This time it was pretty drastic. Everyone was forced out of their homes, apartments, and stores, or wherever they were that day. Nazi officers walked around with their guns ready. People knew not to mess with them. I stood outside in the midst of a huge mob of Jews, standing outside waiting for more orders, and I could hear some people crying in fear. I was trying to stay calm, but of course I was terrified beyond belief. I was clenching my mother's arm and standing behind my brother. I can still hear the cries of family members when those Nazis walked through the crowd screaming those 8 awful words. Men to the left, women to the right. The way these soldiers said this shocked me. The Nazi that separated my family that day was so monotone. I couldn't understand how a man could be so heartless. When I realized what was happening, I couldn't help but scream in not only fear, but also extreme sadness.